you haven't yet, a bit about yourself and why you're interested in the training. It's just really nice for us to know a bit more about you. I think I'll start by introducing myself, and then Juliet can introduce herself, and then we'll jump into the training. Lost my screen there. There we go. So yes, I'm Raeeka. I use they, she pronouns. For a job, I work for Parents for Future, which some of you might have heard of. It's a group that focuses on empowering parents into the climate movement. But I actually have a completely different background. I work in the comms team there, but I've come from a mixture of HR and computer science. And I've been public speaking for about 15 years in different roles. And about 2 years ago, I started volunteering with the Stop Rosebank campaign as a spokesperson, and in some other working groups as well. So I just want to share that because I don't want you to think that you necessarily need to come from a specific like spokesy background. I've kind of come from all over the place and here I am. Juliet, go ahead.
Hi, so my name is Juliet. My pronouns are she, her. Day to day, I work for a gender equality charity, but my background is in academia, and I've got a PhD in psychology. One of the academic projects that I have been working on and off is about climate anxiety, but climate isn't kind of my main specialism in what I do. But I've got quite a lot of years of experience in public speaking, mainly from in academia, having to give lots of presentations and also teaching undergraduates how to make their science communication better. And I've been volunteering with the spokes group for Stop Rosebank for about 18 months now. There we go. So I will just start by giving a quick overview of how the session will be structured this evening. So first we'll give a quick introduction to Rosebank and why spokes work is important to the campaign. And then we'll give some kind of information about background preparation and basics, which will be relevant for any and all types of spokes work. We'll then talk a bit about the different types of spokes work that there are and give some kind of practical tips for things like technology, using video, sound quality, and so on. And then we'll move on to some of the meatier stuff, which is about actually getting the Stop Rosebank message across in speeches and interviews. And then finally, we'll just have a little bit about what you can do after you've done an interview or a speech or anything like that. And we should hopefully have lots of time for questions at the end. So for background, Rosebank is the largest undeveloped oil field in the North Sea. It contains so much oil and gas that burning all of it would produce as much CO2 as the annual emissions of the 28 lowest income countries in the world combined. It's majority owned by Equinor, who are a Norwegian state-owned oil and gas company. And in September, the UK government approved Equinor's bid to develop Rosebank. But this does not mean the fight is over. We're in this for the long haul, and we are very confident that we will stop Rosebank. We've got lots of plans in store for things to do to push back. So, for example, this year we're taking the UK government to court, and we'll be fighting back against Equinor, against the Norwegian government, and against the UK government on every front. There's lots and lots of people involved in the campaign, and there is a lot of power in that, but we need people like you to help us get our message further out there. So as I said, the campaign is made up of lots of different individuals and lots of different groups, and we each have our own kind of skills and methods for making sure Rosebank doesn't go ahead. There are lots of different tactics that are involved in this kind of work to stop an oil field, and messaging, narrative, and informing the public about Rosebank are all critical parts of this work. So by speaking about the campaign in a public space, we're aiming to do two things. Firstly, to raise the profile of the campaign with members of the general public. And secondly, to put pressure directly on decision makers. So those are politicians in the UK, politicians in Norway, and the oil and gas companies themselves. And there are lots of different ways to do this as a spokesperson. So one way that's really good way to kind of get into spokes work or to familiarize yourself with the campaign's talking points and to practice speaking clearly is recording lines for social media content. But we also do stuff like delivering speeches, appearing on panels at events or at rallies, and doing media interviews at kind of varying levels of publicity, depending on how much experience you've got. According to Ofcom, who did a survey in 2019, 75% of adults in the UK use TV as their main source of news. And that is something that is perceived to be the most truthful source of news alongside radio news. So while broadcast media interviews might feel quite nerve-wracking, they are one of the most effective ways to reach a wider audience that we otherwise wouldn't be able to access just through things like social media. So I'll pass to Raeeka.
Thanks, Juliet. So I just want to cover a little bit of the basics for some background prep. What I'll just say is that if you go away with just a few pointers, that will be you a tiny bit further along your journey. Don't feel like you have to remember all of this, but obviously you can come back hopefully to the recording and refresh it. But for me, I know each time I learn something new, I integrate it rather than worrying too much about whether I've memorized the entire spokes training in one session. So yeah, we're going to be talking a little bit about prep you should do ahead of any types of spokes work. Some of you might be aware that there's a part 2 for this training that Rolly's doing, and that will be focused more around kind of managing nerves and making yourself understood, because Rolly's got kind of a theatre background. So we're not going to cover that specifically today. Do make sure you're signed up for that for the second session. But the first thing just to highlight is that the Stop Rosebank campaign has got messaging guides that you can use. And I think Rona's just popped that into the chat. So before you sign up for any sort of speaking activity or you take part in one, just make sure that you're aware of the messaging points so that you're staying accurate and really do lean on them. The next point that I often try to think about is to consider current affairs and the wider political relevance of what's going on in the world. So before you go to speak about anything, just make sure you're up to speed on any breaking news that might have an impact on what you're going to say. It also sounds really obvious, but a helpful tip is to try to write down who your audience is before you start to prepare for it, so that you can sense check that what you're saying is appropriate for who you're talking to. So rather than sort of just writing a speech without necessarily thinking about who you're directing it at, being aware of our audience helps us to avoid jargon, and we can tend to use jargon a lot in the climate movement by mistake, and technical language, and really just try to make it as accessible as possible to everyone. So that brings me on to this idea of a Marge. Who is your Marge? And to write it down every time before you sort of prep, or on your back of the envelope exercise, which we'll go over a bit later. But the concept of a Marge is quite simple. We've all got someone in our lives who we can refer to as our Marge Simpson. And this is someone who is caring and compassionate, but is maybe too busy to be involved in campaigning, or doesn't have a lot of spare time to read into the issues in detail. So imagining that you're talking to your Marge means that you don't speak in the activist or expert language, you speak in a way that they can understand. So your Marge could be a parent, that's often my one. It could be a school friend or someone you met in a pub. And the key thing is that your Marge is not in your work or campaigning bubble, but is someone who would care about the things you work and campaign on if you explained it to them clearly enough. They're effectively a persuadable person. So that's a useful point just to think about in terms of preparation. And then before any sort of interview, it's worth, if you can, to listen or watch the interviewer's previous work to get a sense of what their questioning style might be, and also how on board they are with your cause, whether they've been previously sympathetic or more hostile. And then you can kind of gather that into your preparation and how you might answer some of their styles of questioning. Similarly, thinking about what is your objective. So what's the purpose of you doing this particular interview or speech or whatever it is? Are you trying to recruit more people into the campaign? Are you trying to raise awareness of a very specific message? Or are you trying to respond to a government claim, kind of do a rebuttal? Or is it something else? So being aware of that as an additional point as you prepare, and kind of writing these things down, perhaps on the piece of paper or on your laptop or whatever, so they're top of mind while you're thinking about your preparation, is a really good way to help focus. It's also really, really easy to fall into the trap of trying to convince your interviewer, if you are in an interview scenario, but just try to remember that they are a vehicle for your communication. They're not your target audience. So remember that the interviewer is not your audience. Remembering that can help you avoid getting sidetracked by difficult questions and bring you back to the core messaging you want to get across. And we'll go into a little bit more detail of some tools for what you can sort of use to do that later, but just trying to remember that they are not the target audience, they're just a vehicle for your message. And before we move on and I hand back over to Juliet, I just want to give you maybe 30 seconds to a minute, if you haven't already, to note down who your Marge is. So if you can have a little think about who your Marge might be. And if you want to, you're very welcome to share your Marge in the chat if you immediately know who that person is. You're very welcome to do that. And I'll hand back to Juliet to take over.
Thank you. So the next thing I wanted to say was that there are lots of different types of spokeswork. It's not just kind of giving a speech or doing an interview. It will cover everything from kind of making reels on your own Instagram page to appearing on the news, and there's kind of all of that stuff in between. And there were two kind of main points I wanted to stress with that. The first one being that you don't need to be confident right at the start. We would never want anyone to just be shoved on to doing a television interview or giving a speech if they didn't feel ready or happy to do that. The other thing I really wanted to stress is that you don't need to be good at every type of spokeswork to be a spokesperson. So I am quite confident giving speeches, and I'm quite happy to do things like interviews or panel discussions, but I am really not confident with social media. I don't make reels. I'm like a dinosaur on the internet, and that's fine.
Whereas I'm on the other end of the spectrum and I love social media and making reels. So we each bring our own skills.
The next thing I wanted to talk about was just different types of interviews that you might do. So this is specifically about broadcast media. So that is kind of television or radio interviews. So most interviews can be put into one of two very broad categories, neutral or hostile. And we should note these aren't kind of straight divisions that are easily categorized by specific channels or specific shows, but more likely by the presenter or the interviewer that is going to be conducting the interview. So most broadcast interviews are neutral. And this doesn't mean that the presenters are going to be particularly supportive or they're going to be friendly to you. They will ask you probing questions. They will probably question the stats that you use and question your arguments, but they will do it in a way which lets you answer and let you make your point, because they want to be seen as treating guests equally and not showing particularly obvious bias. The other kind of main category of interviews are hostile broadcast interviews. And this is when the presenter is kind of trying to intentionally pick apart your argument to embarrass you or to undermine you. And that might be due to the kind of political standpoint of the media outlet if they oppose the aims of our campaign. And these kind of interviews will also tend to see presenters be kind of putting forward their own views, and they will probably have researched statistics before the show, which they then try to use to undermine you. There is also a small but growing number of interviews that are what we would call supportive, and this is when the presenter is much more trying to be on your side and asking you helpful questions, which are intending to kind of allow you to get those points across specifically that you want to make. What we've not done here is give you specific examples of who might be supportive or hostile interviewers, because we don't want to set your expectations of a particular interview and have that be wrong. So it's always worth doing some research on the presenters that you might be speaking to if you are doing an interview. And as a general rule, never expect that you're going to get an easy ride. There are some kind of specific things that you can do to prepare if you are doing a broadcast interview. So if you can, ask the producer in advance what questions they're going to ask you, or get them to be extremely clear on the specific topics that you'll be asked about. Get as many details as you can beforehand to make it less stressful for you. So find out the time, the location, the name of the interviewer, whether the interview will be played live or whether it will be pre-recorded and played later. If it's being played later, when will it air? And finally, as I think Raeeka said earlier, try and watch or listen to the program that you're going to be on in advance so you can get an idea of the style that the interviewer has. So, and if you're going to be part of a panel, see if you can find out about the other guests that you'll be appearing with as well. Sometimes you won't know what kind of interview to expect if an interview request is very on the spot. So for example, I've done 2 television interviews and they were both requested about a minute before they happened and then recorded in the street at protests. And in that kind of situation, you might be able to tell a bit about the category to expect based on which channel are asking you to speak. So for example, BBC News compared to GB News would probably have quite different styles, but you won't always be able to tell. And again, I just wanted to stress that if you don't feel like you're prepared for that kind of interview, if it's sprung on you very last minute, you don't have to do it. It can be better to stay off the news rather than end up being misrepresented because you weren't given that time that you needed to prepare.
Okay, I'm going to do a little bit on tech now, because this is an important area to think about and make sure it doesn't kind of catch you out. So if you are doing an interview or something, you want to make where you're recording video, you want to make sure that your background is as tidy and pleasing as possible. I'm not sure I've achieved that today, but I'll let myself off. It could be a bookshelf or a plant. A plain background is also fine. That's better than maybe, things that are really untidy. But, don't underestimate the power of your background for it, making people feel like they can trust you and that you've got something useful to say. And do just be really careful that you don't accidentally include things in the background that you don't want to be viewed publicly. If you're recording a reel or something for social media, then again, you want the background to be similarly not distracting, but also to try and have good levels of natural light if possible. So trying to record in the daytime, it makes quite a big difference for how that looks on the channel. Thinking about framing as well, so trying to have your head and shoulders nice and central in the frame and sit back in a natural position. If you're being filmed by a professional film crew, they'll tell you where they want you anyway. So if you're in studio or anything like that, they'll support you there. For sound, if you're doing a radio interview, try to wear wired earphones for better sound quality. Don't wear the wireless ones because they might disconnect, and actually interviewers don't tend to like them as a result of that and will often check to make sure that you're not wearing them. Whatever you're doing, speak slowly and clearly. It makes you more persuasive and easier to understand. You'll also have a tendency to speed up without realizing that you're doing it when you're nervous. So simply focusing on slowing down makes a big difference to sort of how believable you are and how trustworthy people find you. Finally, with the tech, if you're giving a speech in public, try to get somebody to film you so that you can use the clips later, and also so that you can learn and watch back, because it's really interesting to sort of, it's a bit cringy, but it's useful to look back and see how you did. And then it's a great reason to bring a friend along to a rally. So they should try to get as close as possible to get a good framing of you with minimal other people in the shot, but trying to get, you know, your whole body in if possible. And therefore they'll get a better sound quality. And not in the middle of the crowd because they'll get too much noise. They should be, you know, closer up front. If you're filming on a phone, it's a really good idea to film in portrait rather than landscape, so that the clips are more shareable on social media. Reels will tend to be needed in that portrait direction, and also so that there's space to add captions. So just some thoughts there for recording and reviewing it later. I'll hand back to you, Juliet.
Thank you. Oh, I think that we missed a tiny thing. Oops.
Sorry, that's my fault. That's me forgetting I added another slide. My bad. Just keep myself on my toes. Yeah, one thing I did want to say was just about appearance as well. So it's not just the tech, but thinking about your appearance and how you look. So make sure that fundamentally the most important thing is that you wear something that you feel confident in, and don't underestimate how different it is to sort of speak when you're feeling confident in your clothing and how you look. But a second, I guess, not so ideal point, but is a reality of the society that we live in, is that dressing smartly does help people to take you more seriously, sadly. So obviously bring your personal style into the game, but just be aware of the fact that, you know, you can use that, you can leverage that in a way that makes people sort of trust you and take you seriously. Now I'm really handing back to you, Juliet.
Great. So we're now moving on to the more kind of meaty messaging section now. And I'm starting with what I have dubbed the 3 golden rules of communication, which I'm presenting them here in the context of speeches, but it could just as easily apply to a script that you're writing for a reel, or a caption that you're writing for like a social media post, or really any context where you're planning in advance what you're going to say, and it's just going to be you that's talking rather than when you're going to be asked questions. I should obviously say that these aren't official rules that are being set by anyone. They're based on my own experience doing public speaking and on teaching students how to communicate science effectively. So if you really hate them or they just don't work for you, that's fine. No one's going to be cross. It'll be fine. So the first golden rule is to be clear. So you want the message you're conveying to get across very directly. And if you're not clear, then it's harder for the important information to get through, and there is the potential for people to end up confused. And this applies to the topics that you include in your speech, because you don't want to say things that are confusing or could be misinterpreted, but it also includes the actual language that you use. So try to use simple, non-technical language. And this is also going to sound really obvious, but don't include words in a speech or a reel that you can't pronounce or that you might trip over. If you're writing a script for yourself, or you're using a script that somebody else has written, make sure that you've read it out loud and you've discovered if there are words in there that might trip you up, and then change them to something else, because otherwise it can end up meaning that you're not communicating in a clear way. The second kind of golden rule is to be concise. And this is mainly because people have quite short attention spans, and even the most dedicated person at a rally isn't going to want to sit through loads and loads of really long speeches. It's especially important on something like a reel when you are really restricted by that kind of 90-second time and people's really kind of social media quick scrolling. But even at a rally or a march, you don't really want the speech to be more than about 5 minutes. And this means it's important to try to avoid being repetitive and to try to avoid saying things in a long-winded way if there is a shorter, clearer way to say it, because being concise will often help you to be clear. The final rule, and probably the most important one, and something we did touch on a bit earlier, is to be relevant. This is very linked to being concise, because if you're adding in unnecessary details, you're not going to be concise. But if you're not being relevant, you can also risk not effectively getting the message across, as people might go away remembering the non-essential parts of the speech, which kind of dilutes that message. And what's really important when you're being relevant is that you know who your audience might be and you know the goal of your communication, as that will define what information is the most relevant. So if your audience is people at a climate rally and your goal is to get people to take a particular action, such as sign up for a welcome call, it isn't relevant to talk about how fossil fuels are bad for the environment, because people who have taken the time out of their day to go to a rally already know that. And your goal isn't to change the mind of a climate denier who might be walking past at that time. So the most relevant information is going to be key facts about the Stop Rosebank campaign and how to take part in the particular action that you're promoting. Or as another example, if I was giving a speech to a group of mostly adults, I might talk about how tax breaks and how Rosebank is a waste of taxpayer money. But if I was giving that same or kind of similar talk in a school, I probably wouldn't give that information because school children don't pay tax. Obviously, this isn't every single thing that will make a good speech. And there are lots of other ways of communicating that you might discover that you like better once you've got more experience or more confidence in doing this kind of speaking. But it is a really good framework to have in mind when you're writing a script or kind of looking through a script for a speech. And it's quite a good checklist to go through when you've written a first draft. So write down what you want to say, put it aside and let it kind of sit for a while without thinking about it, and then come back to it and read it out loud to yourself with those questions in mind and ask yourself, is it clear? Is it concise? Is it relevant? What I've done next, I've put together a short exercise on the next slide where I have written a very, very bad introduction to a speech that I have deliberately tried to make very unclear, not concise at all, and not very relevant. So I'm going to read it out and then maybe give you a minute or so to kind of think about the bits that you think violate those rules. And you can write them down or you can just keep that in your head. And then I will show you the bits that I think are bad, and you can see whether or not you agree with me. So I'll read it out. The Rosebank oil field is a massive oil and gas field in the sea in Scotland. There is also gas in the oil field, but we say oil field because it is mostly oil, even though there is some gas. The oil field is located in water that is 150 feet deep. The oil field was named Rosebank after a poem written by Equinor's owner, Anders Opedal. The Rosebank has been granted a license and an approval because of the UK government, not the Scotland government, in September. If we burned all of the oil and gas in the Rosebank oil field, it would create adverse atmospheric conditions due to the increased CO2 emissions created when the carbon and hydrogen atoms in the oil and gas become separated due to heat. And this extra carbon dioxide would be the same amount of carbon dioxide as absolutely loads of people from 28 different countries. So I'll give you about, I should start, at least check what the time is, give you about a minute now to look at which bits of that and kind of write down which bits, or just keep in your head which bits you think violate those rules and why. And then I will come back and show you which bits I think are bad, and hopefully we agree. So I think I've given you about 40 seconds. So I'll go on now to show you the bits that I think are not great, which is most of it. Hang on, where am I? So yeah, I've highlighted in red the bits, the kind of big red flags where I think it kind of breaks all of those rules. So firstly, it uses lots of really vague language like massive oil and gas field or absolutely loads of people, which is not precise and therefore it's not clear. And it's also very repetitive, especially in the sentence about whether Rosebank is an oil field or a gas field, and therefore it's really not concise. It also contains lots of really irrelevant information like the depth of the sea or Rosebank being named after a poem, which are both completely made up facts. Please do not repeat them. And so obviously, because I made them up, they're not relevant. And you probably also noticed that it contains a name that I do not know how to pronounce. I don't know whether that surname is pronounced Opedal or Opedal or Opedal or none of those things. And even if I should know that, I don't want to discover that I don't know and be trying to work it out if I'm giving a speech in front of 100 people. The sentence about the approval is also kind of borderline unintelligible, very unclear. And finally, it includes a lot of really technical and unnecessary information about carbon dioxide that I don't think is ever going to be relevant to a Stop Rosebank campaign. Which is going to make it very unclear as well, because it isn't easy to understand if you don't have a scientific background. So I've been doing spokeswork with Rosebank for about 18 months, and I literally have a PhD. And I had to Google, how does burning oil actually create CO2 to add that information in? So I cannot imagine a context where it will be relevant or clear to include that level of information in a Stop Rosebank speech. So if we strip out all of that bad information in the red, we get kind of, hopefully we agreed on all the bits that were bad, and we get something which is much shorter and much better and a kind of a fairly good starting point for starting a speech. So as a kind of, so very similar to what we said in the introduction, Rosebank is the largest oil and gas field in the North Sea, located off the coast of Shetland. In September, Rosebank was approved by the UK government. If all the oil and gas in Rosebank was burned, it would release the same amount of carbon dioxide as the annual emissions of 700 million people in the global south. So a lot more precise and a lot more concise and hopefully more relevant. So I will pass back over again to Raeeka.
Thanks, Juliet. I loved your random facts. That's great. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is go over, share an exercise that you can use, which should help for preparation with the vast majority of interviews. If you do actually, if you aren't already involved in the spokes group, if you join it, there may be an opportunity in the future to do this NEON training. So this is like, see this as a bite-size whistle stop tour, and if you pick up bits and pieces of it, then great. But there may be an opportunity in the future to do the sort of full 3-hour afternoon where you get to really practice. But I just want to sort of share this with you. So the idea is that, yes, it's the classic back of the envelope technique. So you can get an envelope or just a pen and a piece of paper. And I would recommend that certainly at least, for a long period of time in your spokes journey, it's worth preparing an envelope for each interview that you do. So in the heat of an on-air interview, it's really, really easy to forget the names of the hosts and the other guests. So this is sort of specifically to sort of guide and support with broadcast interviews. So it might sound really ridiculous, but at the top of your piece of paper, and you're very welcome to grab a piece of paper or your envelope and do this along with me now and just sort of think about an interview that you'd like to have in your mind. It's a really good idea to write the names of the host and the other guests. I know that I'm rubbish at names, so I will immediately forget everybody's names if I don't have it written down. So do make a note of that at the top of your envelope or your piece of paper. It's also a really good idea that you greet them and thank the host for having you on the show using their name. I think many people know this, but it's also a subtle way of asserting power and control in an interview situation if you actually use the interviewer's name. So good morning or good afternoon, Emma. Thank you for having me on the show. It kind of immediately gives you a little bit of power. The next thing that you might like to write on your envelope is a personal affirmation or a confidence boost to repeat to yourself. So it's very, very personal. I deserve to be here. I am enough. My words matter. It's really just sort of down to you and what works for you. If you have one that's coming to mind that you'd love to share, feel free to pop it in the chat, or if you're already doing folks work and you have one that you use, then feel free to do that. Mine's actually usually just one word, which is breathe, because as soon as I breathe, I'm good. As soon as I forget to breathe, I'm not good. But feel free to add one in the chat. It doesn't matter if you feel like it's a bit cheesy. It's nice to share if you feel like sharing it. That's just to support you. So much of these media appearances are about confidence. And unfortunately, so much of this confidence is based in structural entitlement and systemic oppression. And so what we're talking about here is misogyny, male entitlement, queerphobia, and racism. We're talking about educational privilege. So there'll be, you know, all of us will have varying privileges and levels of power. And taking up space while also holding identities that are oppressed or marginalized is actually part of the healing work of liberation. So if you're showing up here lacking confidence as a result of sort of systemic oppression, then just know that, you know, showing up, doing this training and being willing to participate and take up space is, you know, is part of the collective liberation that we all need, that is bigger than the Rosebank campaign, but that the Rosebank campaign is a part of. Not everyone has got a background where they've been socialized to feel confident in putting themselves forward. So although an affirmation that tells you you deserve to be here doesn't necessarily address the structural issues, it can just help you kind of ground yourself and bring yourself back to navigate any feelings that come up in the spaces that you're in, to remind you that you are entitled to be there and you can take up space. There's also a suggestion to put a smiley face on the envelope or your piece of paper, and that's actually to remind you to smile. It sounds a bit silly, but it is really helpful, because if you forget anything else, smiling can actually make you appear really relaxed and calm. I had another like last minute Sky News interview. Where was it? I think it might have been at the big one or somewhere else, that I was asked to do about 10 minutes before. And it was one of those walking backwards in a protest while they're into, it was like literally the worst combination of inputs and last minutes and everything. And I am smiling so hard in that interview. I look so calm. I am not calm. But I'm like, oh wow, I look really chill. I look like I really know what I'm talking about. So just smile your head off is what I would say. But yeah, find that smile so that you can appear relaxed and calm. Try to also write down the name of your marge on your piece of paper or your envelope to remind you about the language and the messaging, that it should be free from activist jargon and language. And also try to avoid using too many stats and numbers, because your marge would probably be overwhelmed by too many of those. You should try to approach your interview thinking about the people out there who are yet to be convinced of the importance of the work that you're doing. And naming your marge is, you know, a first step to develop. Naming your marge is one of the first steps to developing your key messages. So on the envelope where it says key messages, they need to be speaking to your marge. And once you've done that, you're going to need to work out what you're actually going to say in the interview, which is your key messages. And your key messages should make up the core of what you're going to say. And again, I would recommend writing those messages on the 3 points of the triangle on the back of your envelope. And these key messages are really important, as in an interview where you've got a lot of, you know, you're quite time sensitive, you've got a very small window of opportunity to get across the important things you want to say to your audience, and, you know, what you're trying to achieve with the interview. So good messaging should really engage your base, you know, the people that already agree with you, persuade the middle, which is your marge, and then present the hardline opposition, the people who aren't going to agree with you, as the outliers that they are. And after you've written down your messages, you can start to think about whether or not they pass this test. So your key messages shouldn't just be 3 random things that you think are important. You know, they should be kind of crucial components to your communication. And the content and wording of your message is going to dictate whether or not you can persuade new people to your cause or not. The key messaging can also be important as a means of accountability for an organization that you're representing. So these are the messages that you've agreed with your organization. So for example, with Stop Rosebank campaign are the most important ones, and that you've committed to making sure they get aired to the best of your ability. So as Rona shared higher up in the chat, we've got some of those messaging guides that will contain some of that key messaging that's already kind of predetermined from a Rosebank perspective. And there is also always an opportunity, if you do know in advance that you've got a speaking opportunity coming up, to have a chat with people in the spokes team, people at Uplift, to make sure that you're really clear on what the key messages are and that you're being as strategic as possible. So in that triangle, it's suggested that you have shared values. If you're trying to convince new people of your position, it's always a good idea to start your sentence with a statement which builds a bridge with your audience. This is sometimes called like creating a big us, and it often takes the forms of statements like most people would agree that, or we all care deeply about, or everyone has a right to. So that is one of the kind of key messages, is to think, what are the shared values that you're trying to communicate, and have that on one of the points of your triangle. The next one is problem or impact. So it's really important that you try to lay out in clear terms what the problem is that you're on air to talk about, and the impact that this problem has on people. So for example, the government wants to go ahead with Rosebank, the largest undeveloped field in the UK, even though it isn't compatible with our net zero target, won't reduce our energy costs or increase energy security. Just as a kind of broad stroke example that communicates the problem and the impact that it has on us. And then the third point of the triangle is the solution. So this is really important, because all of the evidence suggests that messages which don't include solutions actually make people feel worse about the prospects of change. And that means that you could be making a win for your cause less likely if you don't get across any solutions. So it's also recommended that you emphasize design wherever possible. And that means explaining that the current situation was created by someone for a reason, and that it can be redesigned to be better. So for example, it doesn't have to be like this. The government could be investing in renewables, retrofitting homes in order to protect a livable planet. You know, we don't just say stop Rosebank, we offer some of the solutions that we know are on the table. Could you go to the next slide for me, Juliet? Thank you. So the next thing on your envelope is the phrase that pays. And this is really the one thing that you want to be remembered from for your interview. So often it will be a metaphor or imagery that will sort of stick in people's minds, and you'll want to say this phrase at least once, but quite likely a few times if you can in the interview. It can also be really, really short, so literally just a phrase rather than a whole sentence. And if it rhymes or has alliteration, then even better. But we're just trying to come up with something that's sticky so that it stays in people's minds. And there's some suggestions that I've sort of lifted from the Neon handbook for the training on the spokesperson training. So you can kind of see how that correlates in terms of what you might like to say, and an example of a phrase that pays. So it's worth sitting down and spending some time on thinking about what your phrase that pays is going to be, because you might be using it multiple times across multiple media interviews, and maybe trying to get a bit creative about what a good phrase that pays might be to hammer your message home. Again, this is the kind of thing that if you aren't already, you can join the Spokes working group to sort of share ideas on, and also look at the messaging guide, which will give you some sort of existing short phrases that pay, or ways of saying things that are more sticky. So why do we have the triangle? Could you go back actually, or go forwards maybe? Sorry, I'm trying to think, so we can't see it now, can we? Is it back there? No, sorry, could you go back just to the triangle so we can see it on the, that's it. So the reason that we have the triangle there is not just because we're trying to sort of have, you know, a nice geometric shape there on the envelope. It's because the idea is to sort of help you to think a bit non-linearly about your key messages, because you're not necessarily going to get them out in the order that you're imagining. It's not like a shopping list to read out. You'll get asked questions that correspond to different key messages, and you will need to sort of learn to be prepared to move around your triangle, whether that's at the shared value point or the solution point or the problem or impact point. So just using that as a visual to remind you that to be as fluid as you possibly can. There's a point then about statistics and numbers, which I've covered a little bit already, about talking to your Marge. You're never going to win an argument on statistics alone. And for many people, hearing big numbers being thrown around just alienates them. Using stories is best wherever possible, but having 1 or 2 statistics to hand is useful. So it's always about making sure that your numbers are 100% accurate. So please use the messaging guide. Please check the messaging guide before you talk to anybody, because an incorrect statistic can actually totally derail an interview, and then you'll end up undermining your own point without intending to. A couple of useful tips if you do want to use some stats and numbers. Fractions seem bigger than percentages. So if it's 20%, it's better to say 1 in 5. And if you want to make a proportion of something seem smaller, it's better to use percentages. So try to just use that in a way that works for you. Big numbers are also quite hard to understand. So instead of saying 200,000 people, you could say the equivalent of the size of the city of Portsmouth, or kind of like what we do with Rosebank when we say the same amount of annual emissions as the lowest income 28 countries in the world. Like, that's easier to understand than the figure itself. Try and round up or down. So, you know, if it's close to 1 million, say almost 1 million rather than 9,860, whatever it is. As you can see, that was hard for me to even say just then. So say almost 1 million. And if you can't express a statistic in a sentence easily, don't use it. That means it's not a good one for you to use. So touching on stories. Stories are a brilliant way to try to connect with new audiences. So it's a good idea to have a reminder of a relevant story on your envelope if you want to be able to use it. So this could be a personal story about you, or a story about someone that you work with, or it could be a more generalized story that paints a vivid picture. And sometimes it can be nice to do an element of vulnerability in a story using your own personal story. So I'll give an example that because I'm a parent, that's a really easy angle for me to bring some vulnerability and personalization in, and softness into the messaging that makes it kind of hard for someone to disagree with my opinion about a livable planet for my child. So trying to think about how the stories can humanize and personalize what you're doing is useful, and having one written on your envelope as a reminder can be handy to have. Could you go forward? We go to the ABCs. There we go. Okay, so another thing to have on your envelope as a reminder is the ABCs. And this is like a spokesperson's best friend. So if you're worried about being asked a question that you do not have a clue how to answer, or is just tangential to where you want to be, then if you can memorize the ABCs, you should be able to get yourself back on track. And you will notice that politicians and good spokespeople use this all the time. You just maybe didn't notice before because you didn't realize it was a technique. So yeah, you can be asked anything from unhelpful questions to tangential ones, or really, in the worst case scenario, completely hostile questions. And it's easy to get derailed by these lines of questioning. You can forget your key message, or you can get bogged down in a part of the debate that you never intended to be involved in. So the ABC is a fundamental way that you can steer the interview back to the topics and messaging that you want to talk about. It's not always easy, but as you practice, you can get the hang of doing it and using this method. So I'm going to explain what we mean by the ABCs and give you some examples, and there are some on the slide there as well. But the A is to acknowledge. So the first thing that you need to do is acknowledge the question that you're being asked. You can't pretend it hasn't been asked. I know some politicians do that, or go straight into answering a different question. But one of the most important things to remember is that it's okay to say if you don't have a specific statistic in front of you, and it's much better to say that rather than to attempt to make one up. But acknowledging is a really important thing to sort of start that ABC process. And we've got an example here. So on this slide, it says someone says something and you can say, that's clearly an important question, or I'm glad you brought that up. So you kind of just acknowledge that they've asked you a question, and then you can move into the next step. And the next step is the bridge. So once you've acknowledged your question, you need to try to build a bridge to delivering your message. So this is a technique which takes you away from potentially difficult ground onto speaking directly to your audience about the issues that you want to talk about. And on the slide, we've got an example there. So yeah, we've gone, that's clearly an important question. And then the bridge goes, but what you asked me on here to speak about is, or but to put in a different perspective, So you can start to bring yourself back to the ground that you want to for your key message. And then C is communicate your message. Those key messages that we've talked about already that you'll be thinking about and planning ahead, that's the bit that really matters. So at that point, you can deliver your key messages, hopefully after successfully navigating away from a question that you might not want to answer at all. If you go to the next slide, Juliet, I think there's some more examples there as well. So we can just give people a chance to have a quick look at these. So yeah, I can't speak for every XYZ. It's quite a good one because sometimes they try to expect you to speak on behalf of an entire population of people and you couldn't possibly do that. Yeah, so just having a few in your pocket, you know, there's 8 here that you can use that are really handy, but just being ready to have those acknowledgements, those bridges, and then taking yourself back to the key message, remembering that your interviewer is the vehicle, they are not your audience, so it's actually okay to use this mechanism to kind of get to where you need to get to. And then really just to sort of finish on looking at the envelope and the different things that we can do to prepare using this technique. It's really important, as I kind of stressed before, that we indicate that we can take action. So we need to leave people feeling like there's something tangible that is being done and can be done, and not leave people feeling hopeless. So just making sure you've got hope somewhere on your envelope so that you can come back with a solution and give people the sense that, you know, there is hope and there is a future for all of us collectively. We just need to work towards it. So yeah, I think that's pretty much everything that I wanted to cover on that for now, and we can obviously dive a little bit deeper into it if you've got some questions around it too, but otherwise for now I will hand back to Juliet.
Great. So hopefully now we are experts. We've done our speech or we've done our interview, and there are just some kind of specific things that it's quite important to do after you've done that bit of spokeswork. So immediately afterwards, what I think is the most important thing is just to take a little bit of time for yourself, even if that is 2 minutes to do some grounding exercises, or literally just finding a private space and just having a big shake off the stress. It's good to acknowledge you have done something that can be really stressful. You've done an amazing job, and you probably still have quite a lot of adrenaline in your system that you want to get out, because it can make you, you know, even as quite an experienced spokesperson, sometimes it is still really scary or you feel really nervous, and having that time to reset is really helpful. So I like, if I'm giving a speech at a rally, I always try and make sure that I've brought a friend with me so that afterwards I can just make them give me a hug or spend some time decompressing, go for a coffee, just do something nice immediately afterwards. The next steps are more kind of practical spoke steps. You will have some audio or some video clips that you can share on social media of the spokeswork, and you can share these on your own socials if you have them. You don't need to get Stop Cambo to share them for you, and you don't need to get permission for the Stop Cambo official page to post them for you. You don't need to get permission from them for you to post them. The only time really that you'll need to get permission for posting something is if you're using footage that isn't yours. So for example, if you've done an interview and it hasn't aired yet, you know, make sure that you've got permission to share clips so that you're not kind of accidentally breaking a scoop that you weren't supposed to. One thing to note about putting things online is that we always try to make them as accessible as possible, to make the movement just accessible. So Instagram has pretty good auto captioning, but I would check the accuracy before you finally post everything, because it does have some hard times sometimes, especially with words like Rosebank or Equinor, because they aren't words that are in the dictionary, and sometimes it just makes up weird gap fillers, and obviously they are quite key words that we want to be accurate in the captions. They're, you know, the main ones. There are free online tools, things like CapCut, that can also help you edit and caption videos so that they are as accessible as possible. And so we do really recommend that you are putting captions on things like Reels and Stories on Instagram if you can. If you are really struggling to edit a video, firstly, don't panic. You don't need to have the same kind of professional quality media on your own socials as are on the kind of official Stop Rosebank feed. So don't compare a video that you've made on your phone with something that's on the Stop Rosebank official feed that has been filmed and edited using professional equipment, or it's had a green screen and it's been kind of produced. If you are really struggling, you can put a shout out into the Spoke Slack channel and see if anyone has any capacity to help you. But just be aware that obviously sometimes everyone is really busy and they might not be available to help you right then. And it is better to have something that is kind of timely and relevant and are kind of not super great quality than just to not have anything put out, or to have something put out weeks later when somebody had capacity to help you. Once something is on social media, if you're posting it there, whether that's a speech or an interview recording, or if it's a reel that you've made, if you post it into the Spoke Slack channel, other members can then kind of go and give it some love, and it helps boost the algorithm. It gets a bit more engagement. It gets more people to see it, which is also good. The final thing then is just to reflect on how it went. And so if you have got that video or audio that you can watch or listen back, then kind of go back over that recording and then use that reflection to help you prepare for your next bit of spokes work and to help you kind of build your skills and confidence in doing stuff in the future. Again, this is something that you might want to do, or you could possibly do with the rest of the spokes group, to get feedback from other people and to kind of collectively go through it. And so again, that's something you can ask in that spokesperson Slack channel, and we can add it onto a meeting agenda. Obviously, sometimes we are really busy, and depending on what other stuff is going on in the campaign, it might not happen immediately. But if you ask, then we will do our best for it to be helped so that you can get that kind of feedback from other people and not just be reflecting by yourself. And I think going back to Raeeka for next steps.
Yes, we are. So the next step, if you haven't already, is to join the Slack channel and subscribe to the spokespeople group there. There's a QR code on the screen that you can use, and I think Rona's just popped it into the chat for you to join. So it's a really great space, again, just to get some of that support and feedback and updates. And also that's where spokes opportunities often come through. So if you are based in a particular area, we'll do shout outs there for you to step forward for, if you're interested in doing the spokes opportunities. We don't have a fixed agenda of spokes work, so most of it is ad hoc and geared around what's needed for the specific campaigns and the specific objectives that we have. But as I said, the opportunities do usually get posted in that channel. And when there are specific campaign updates that might be good to make reels about, or there are specific updates to be shared on social media, this is brought up in the spokesperson meetings, and the messaging guides are provided for each of these actions as well. So there's lots of support just simply by being in that Slack channel. You get a significant amount of help there. I can't remember how often our spokes meeting is, so Jessica might have to remind me, but you do get a calendar invite. Do you remember, Juliet?
I think it's every 3 weeks at the moment, which I think is why it's harder to remember, because there is a different number in every month depending on when it happens. But I think it's every 3 weeks.
Yeah, Jess has just said that. Thank you. So yeah, it's every 3 weeks. And obviously you don't have to come every time. You come as many times as if you've got availability and you can come, that's fine. But also just being in the Slack channel is great, just to engage and understand and see what there is to do. I think I also am supposed to be flagging some training with you that's coming up. So there's the second one of these, which Rolly is doing. And then there's a welcome call as well. Rona, do you mind if I hand over to you just to do that? Because I'll probably get the dates and times wrong.
Yeah, of course. It's a little bit complicated because there's a few different things. But tomorrow there is a kind of campaign-wide coordination call, which I'll put the link in the chat for. So that's all of the different working groups, including spokes, but also kind of regional campaign groups who kind of come together to do a bit of coordination activity. So if you want to come along to that, you can sign up on that link. I'm going to put all of this in an email afterwards as well, so don't feel like you need to gather all of these links immediately. And the last thing is, if you are feeling a little bit like, whoa, what is all of this information, and you want to get to grips a little bit more with the campaign and how it's structured, and the different working groups, there's 2 others as well. There's an MSP lobby working group, and a welcome call working group, or a welcome working group, who kind of do all of the onboarding into the campaign. We have a welcome call coming up on the 7th of February. So that will be a longer introduction to the campaign, similar to what Raeeka and Juliet did today, but going into a bit more depth, and also a bit of an orientation of the Slack and how we organise everything. So that's a really good one to come on to if you're feeling like, what the hell is all of this? I think that is everything, but I will put all of these links in an email afterwards. We are also going to hang on, so don't feel like you need to jump off immediately for a Q&A. So feel free to stick around if you have any questions.
Just if it's okay, I'd like to just speak to something in the chat that Catherine said, because I think it's well worth stressing this. Once you've been in a spokes group, should we take the slides down so we can see each other? Once you've been in spokes for a while, you can forget, but actually, you know, I didn't have a clue how to do any of this 2 years ago, and I just started doing social media reels and doing like one line here or there, and then I would heavily pre-script, you know, spend ages on the script for a rally that I'd be like, oh, I'm going to be speaking for 1 minute, but I need to get this right. And now, sort of 2 years on, I get asked to do random Sky interviews walking backwards at protests. So there is a trajectory, like you don't have to you don't have to like immediately know what you're doing. You do kind of build up and gain more skills. It's not that you'd be chucked in and asked to do a broadcast interview if you weren't feeling comfortable to do that. So I just want to make sure everyone is aware of that, because it's easy for us to talk about it as if it's just like that, but it's not. It takes time.
Amazing, thank you. Shall we move on to a little Q&A section? Is there anything else? Cool. I'm gonna stop the recording then.